Hey, Dog Nation. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We are absolutely slammed on today's show. It is Jeff Sintel, as per usual, and himself, Tony Barnhart, going to be a part of our program. In between now and then, explains why Georgia is among the to have you with us. It's great to have you with us. I am begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is presented by Kroger. More ways to save fresh food, low prices.
Podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Trying to get a little bit better. Georgia just finished up yesterday, and a lot of this kind of stuff, form cliche, this is worth paying attention to. And by the way, it's great to have you with us today as a part of DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. So let me go back in time to exactly a week ago. Kirby Smart addressing the media, and there was one person in particular that he wanted to give a little credit to before the state.
Some really good bars kind of hit from a MAC stand summer, and we don't get to see a lot of it because our players it's very time intensive. Sometimes they have to have 4 and 5 workouts a day with different groups. So excited to get started.
So that's not necessarily breaking new ground from a coach. Kirby sounds pretty much like every coach when he says they get better than anybody else. But I was thinking about what Kirby Smart said last Friday when I had a chance to be in Athens yesterday as a part of Georgia practice, because a couple of the guys we got a chance to talk to were guys who seemed to be pretty good blueprints for what Scott Sinclair and the strength and conditioning program for Georgia were doing during the offseason. One of those guys is Azeez Ojulari. And by now, if you travel around the pages of DawgNation or if you're this season, that was true before Brenton Cox's departure. It may be more true now that Cox isn't here anymore. Ojulari got a chance to play in the Sugar Bowl, seemed to show some pass rushing chops, and with Georgia looking to upgrade that spot this year, Ojulari could be called strength and conditioning work that Scott Sinclair's been doing. In fact, here is the way that Ojulari answered some of those questions.
Well, I have gained like a good 10 to 15 pounds. Thanks to the strength coach and the strength staff, it just helped me develop and get bigger and stronger.
Doing some, conditioning work as well to be able to make those weight gains while also working on speed and agility as well. And the hot Georgia, to speak directly to Richard LeCount as well as he could, and he said he wanted to work on some technique stuff to get better at that. But the other thing he wanted to bring was a lot bigger. And when he spoke yesterday, kind of on this same vein, he said, you know what, being the bigger version of Richard LeCount, being a little thicker now, yeah, it makes SEC practices against these.
And there was with those big old hogs down there. So I have a lot of confidence in my tackling ability now. Also.
So Kirby says, yeah, we try to get stronger this summer, and a couple of the guys yesterday put their hand up. Count says, yeah, I'm a little thicker now, and it makes practice. We'll see this in terms of who becomes the recruiting priorities for Georgia. Take wide receiver Dominic Blaylock for a moment. I want to talk that I think fits pretty well in this discussion in terms of just what Georgia, Kirby Smart included, wants to see from all of the players on its roster right now. Here is LeCount describing how it feels to do battle against the incoming freshman.
Get ready to tackle. And so, I see him as, not liking it, you're not, ready for him. He's going to blow past you.
So listen, I think that what LeCount says there is really interesting, and I think it goes to show you how a football player competing against another player sees a guy compared to how sometimes we see him only watching the stuff on video, TV, or maybe, when we see that stuff from high school of him there at Walton in the Atlanta area, putting that toe in the dirt and making a man miss, putting on a nice kind of spin maneuver. I don't count says doing battle with him every day. This is a bigger guy than you might think. This is a guy that kind of packs a load when you get ready to go tackle him. You got to be ready to handle that. He's got the speed as well, but this is not a small, skinny players to be as big as they can and be able to maintain their athleticism out there on the field. Now, at this point in time, as I said before, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is not new ground. This is not new turf. This is the kind of thing that every football coach talks about to some measure. Georgia wants to do with its roster. Make the big guys even bigger. Look for a big version of every elite recruit that it brings in with its recruiting classes. Find the biggest of the 5 stars, the biggest of the high. He writes now for ESPN, used to work for Football Study Hall, which is a part of the SB Nation family of websites. And he did some research last December. And when this came out, what predicts that success? And sometimes those are complicated stats, and sometimes they're not today. But what Conley has found is is that one of the simplest predictive measures down here in numbers. For instance, one of the things that Conley points out is that the average player weight for an SEC player a year ago, this is the 2018 season, was 241 pounds. The rest of the Power Five of the roster. And one of the things that you see is the SEC teams that are the biggest, according to the Conley numbers here, are the ones that are also winning the most. So keep that in mind. When Kirby Smart says these things, it sounds see how it could impact the way that an Azeez Ojulari performs this season, or the way that a Richard LeCounte performs this season, having stated that one of his goals is to be a better tackler. When you see the in which you're looking for Georgia to be bigger than maybe it's been in the past and bigger than most of the rest of the kind of average better for Georgia, and one of the reasons why Georgia is a major title contender here in 2019. On video, 10 a.m., Dog Nation, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous Dog Nation. We have kind of a staggered start around here where different counties are getting going at different time. My kids have been in school now seemingly for a while, more than a week, I guess. So as you're kind of getting back in school, think about those back for snack and stuff. I guess they just eat all day long at school. I'm really glad that Kroger offers great savings and stuff like that because, let's face it, my kids are going to eat me out of house and home. Coming up very, very soon, we're going to have our big Dog Nation season kickoff event. We call it the Kroger Kickoff. And this was a month incoming. Now, let me give you the address on this. That's 5550 Bethelview Road. Once again, 5550 Bethelview, way, way bigger than the kind of supermarket stuff you're used to seeing. You can buy, or you can get to the Atlanta area on, can't wait for that. We've got two big guests on Georgia, the rest of the SEC. That'll be fun with our buddy Tony coming up in just a few minutes. Of course, Jeff Sentell here on this Friday allianced us with this past Wednesday involving five-star cornerback Elias Ricks. We'll do all of that coming up. For now, though, let me go around the doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Merriweather and Tharp, and yesterday you may have heard Barrett Sallee from CBS Sports reference the blue chip ratio that Bud Elliott for SB Nation does every single year. He looks at the percentage of 4- and 5-star recruits on the you don't have a majority of your roster. That means 51% or more. Dive deeper for a moment about why that blue chip ratio matters as much as it does. Georgia's at about, 78, pushing the door on 80%, according to the podcast with Clay Travis. And he was talking about arriving on Ohio says he didn't believe. But it was true then, and it's true for us.
You're going to go in, and everybody 4 or 5 years later, we're going to look at this class. I mean, these guys are everybody's all senior, just blown away. Like, can't imagine when he's a true freshman. Like right now, the kids who are rising freshmen, we would look at their 22 of them if we're trying to predict that they're going to be 5 easy. And sure enough, you go back and look at recruiting classes. When my dad said that, I thought he was crazy. He's right. I mean, whether a guy gets an injury, a guy gets home, you get 50% of those that hit. You're having a pretty good class.
And that is why the blue chip ratio matters. The percentage, the total number of former 4- and 5-star guys you have on your roster. Because if you only sign 10 of those, which a lot of teams only do, even teams that think of themselves as contenders. As Kirk says, about half those guys aren't going to pan out. So now you're down to 5. If you're George and you're signing 20 of those, well, now you're down to 10, which is a lot better than most. They're hardly ever going to bat better than 500. You're going to have departures, like the one that Georgia saw with Brenton Cox this year. But college football continues to be a numbers game. When you stack as many 4- and 5-star guys as you can, the numbers are on your side. That was from the Wins and Losses podcast with Clay Travis. I'd invite you to check that out. And, of course, Bud Elliott for SBNation.com. You can check that out as well. By the way, Around the Doghouse, presented by my friends at Merriweather and Tharp. Divorce can be scary, but the good news is you don't have to go through it alone. Merriweather and Tharp, helping thousands of clients over the years, has been through this process now thousands of times. And, if you can save your marriage, you should. But if you find yourself in a situation where it just seems untenable and unsavable, well, the best thing you can do is put an advocate on your side. That's what Merriweather and Tharp provides for you. So please check them out online at The Atlanta. Help you if you find yourself in a...
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, Jeff Sentell, I have been tasked with a duty by so many of your readers at DawgNation.com or the DawgNation Forum or those who listen in. A quick good morning and a quick hello, and then we'll dive into it if you don't mind. Hope you're doing well.
Doing well, sir. Hope everybody's well, and can't wait to jump into all this today.
So, listen, I obviously love the twists and turns of recruiting. I have such a good time by skepticism. You know, I'll admit that I kind of lean more in the skeptical direction than the optimistic direction based on what you said on Wednesday, Leaf, that at some point in time Georgia could find itself silently in a mix for the claim for that. Did notice on social media this week that Kendall Milton, the friend of, in kind of a edit of both those guys in their high school uniform, Milton clearly seems to be suggesting there what I think you've long believed, that this is more information on this now. What is up with Georgia and another potential five-star defensive back like Elias Ricks?
Well, I think there's clearly something there, Brandon. I think there's clearly folks in the DawgNation forum, we've been discussing that fact as well, that it's jumping over 600,000 views as of this. Just kind of condense it all, Brandon. Class to be the best one that Kirby Smart and his staff has ever signed, and then one that can challenge for the nation's #1 overall. There is a number of silent commitments that are very big names.
It's just the overall, feeling of, as you say, Georgia trying to build, one of the greatest classes of all time. An Alabama wide receiver group that's very speedy. That's not going out of style for the major contenders anytime. In the future, Jeff, as much as we think of the SEC as being a line of scrimmage league, it's what you do on the outside. Defensive backs, wide receivers, and those on the perimeter. Those one-on-one battles between skill offensive guys.
Ball and grass to it, especially with the new interpretations of the rules for downfield contact, about what guys can and cannot do. And I think it's still a big anomaly, Brandon, how defenders aren't supposed to tackle, very fine line about what will defensive football be in the near future. And I think the Stokes part of the equation would just have to work with the Jordan Davis, Trayvon Walker, Zion Logue, Nolan Smith, Azeez Ojulari part of the equation. And that is, if the upfront guys are harassing the quarterback, knowing these receivers, it's going to create a lot of problems for people when they want to play Georgia. I always have felt, Brandon, that all this stuff about havoc, and 20% of the time they want havoc played, is I feel Georgia is very confident this year about the back end of its defense with guys like J.R. Reed, Rat Trap, Richard LeCount, Mark Webb, Eric Stokes. Keep going down that line. Tyreek Stevens to turn up the heat in the kitchen, in the pocket, and in the front.
I think the media out of the air, get those passes broken up. That ends up contributing to interceptions as a ratio of the total PBU lanes. And can you knock those balls out of the air? That's what this Georgia 5 stars into that mix for future secondaries doing that same thing. Dog fans expect it to be Keely.
No, I know that's a rat trap question there, Brandon, but it seems like Elias Ricks, who could it be in their mock classes? There's a thread for that. But in that mix where Georgia somehow is getting up to 9, 8, 9, 10 5-stars in the 2020 class, at least half of those, maybe even more than half, would be coming off the defensive side of the ball.
4-star running back Tank Bigsby, a fan favorite with many UGA fans, going to announce his commitment later on this evening. You said on Tuesday you don't expect it to be Georgia. Obviously, it's easy to understand why you feel that way. But would you mind giving us a little more details about how you think the timeline of all this played out? When did Bigsby recruitment of Zachary Evans for us one more time, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. So on Wednesday, when we didn't have a certain gentleman's name in the top targets list, after he'd been a lot about maybe our perception of where he feels about Georgia right now. In actuality, the timeline still messes up with what Bigsby had always wanted to do. He wanted to make it do. But this is a long game, Brandon. I think we've talked about this a lot. I think it's the common talking point to be, because we talk about this young man a lot, being one of the top 50 players in the country and one of the top 6 or 7 running backs. There's a true chance that Zachary Evans will also join this Georgia class at some point this year. Of course, it's going to be a contested recruitment with Texas A&M and that wild day, Brandon. Game there that you stand trying to play with the rest of it, as I see. And nothing will be final until the ink is faster in the short shuttle pro drill than anybody, I think, on the Georgia roster right now. Including, that's just something you decide to play for. You decide to go for it all because you can, because that running back room, Georgia just has, worst-case scenario, the 2020 backfield will look like likely a supercharged Zamir White, James Cook. Both of those guys will be there, and you go, all right, let's go for the very best, because it's no different than any other position on the Georgia roster. They're recruiting the best inside linebackers, the best outside linebackers, the best cornerbacks, the best offensive linemen. And why should this running back position, the glamour position at the University of Georgia, be any different? They want to bring in a player that will push those starters and take away reps from even guys like the Whites, the Cooks, the McIntoshes, and the Miltons of the world. And that, my friend, is a player like Zachary Evans.
Let me squeeze in one final question before we let you go. You talked about the MJ Sherman piece that you wrote at DawgNation.com the other day, the 5-star line down. Maybe a little bit of a window in Georgia's perspective on this right now, too. I hope people read this for themselves at DawgNation.com because Sherman's always a fascinating subject, but he's also
It does. It definitely does. And you sit there, and Theo Johnson's going to be an interesting tight end prospect. I think Brennan and I have spoken about the tight end recruiting position more this fall than in all previous, or this recruiting cycle than in all previous 1,003 episodes of DawgNation Daily up to this point, or at least up until episode 8, going to take a bunch of back-to-back visits, hear the good juju and the good vibes he gets from all those schools, and I think ultimately that will make up his decision.
Well, Jeff, it's really good stuff, and boy, we appreciate your coverage at the forum at forum.dawgnation.com, on the website at dawgnation.com, and of course each week here on DawgNation Daily as well. Hope you presented by Kroger today. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to speaking to you soon.
Caleb Williams, and if you don't want to reach for a box of Sour Patch Kids candy after reading that, we'll gladly refund your money on reading that first.
Yeah, we're looking forward to talking about
The rest of the league.
James Williams, the 2021 defensive back. I think two really fascinating names, dazzling prospect, and getting to learn a little bit more about him is going to be a lot of fun. So make sure you check out Jeff's intel on that. My friends, the Atlanta and North Georgia Building Trades Council. Now, opportunities, living wages, and they protect benefits for all construction. It's GeorgiaConstructionCareers.com 005. You want to make more money, have better pay. All right, SEC through. A couple things I've heard that Clemson coach Dabo Swinney has chosen not to give a national championship ring to now Missouri quarterback Kelly Bryant. Bryant played some for Clemson the season with the team, and so therefore Swinney's not going to give him a national championship ring. And this is giving him a prize for something he technically did not participate in. And, for the most part, I don't really care one way or another, but I do think this just goes to show you how we are currently influenced. Dabo Swinney says here, listen, Bryant's not a bad guy. Clearly his teammates all really, really like him, but he didn't finish the season with this team. I'm going to establish the precedent that only those guys get national championship rings. And I don't really feel like is all that scandalous. I don't. I mean, to me, it's very different than backup. I mean, it's hard to imagine this or even think about this, but what if Jake Fromm had left the Rose Bowl hobbled? I mean, Eason did come back in for a brief moment in that first Super Bowl back in, was it 2001? Is that the right year on that? But the point is that, I mean, there's a certain kind of way to be a really cheer. I don't fault Bryant for leaving because he wanted to play and he knew that 4-game, mark was an important thing for him. He wanted to be eligible to go play somewhere else. He'd lost it, used to say. You literally cannot have your cake and eat it too. You can't leave Clemson and then have the spoils that go along with being at Clemson, no matter how much, social media culture, may want to argue against that. So in this case, I mean, listen, nobody likes, sort of ragging on Dabo Swinney more than I do. But in this case, I don't really feel like there's a whole lot about leaving the program. Jeremy Pruitt made it clear this was completely Niehause's decision to do this. And in that statement, Niehaus goes on to talk about a number of Tennessee when it comes to this. A lot of this stuff is probably just bad luck. It's rotten luck for Tennessee, and Jeremy Pruitt in particular is going to have to address all of DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. Read him all over the internet, including we really appreciate you being with us. Hope you've enjoyed I hope you had a good summer, and it's good to have you back with us here on DawgNation Daily today.
Well, thank you, Brandon. Yeah, it was a good summer. It was all too quick. But, yeah, I've been doing my little speaking tours here now and then, and the people are really excited, and they get me excited. So yeah, I'm ready to go.
And listen, obviously I talk about Georgia every day. I talk directly to Georgia fans every day, and I'm sure you're not surprised to know that there's a real sense of there's a temptation to want to tempt out of college football, and you certainly are able to take the emotion out of this more so than anybody else. I mean, how the standard it wants to measure itself by, which is national championship or bust.
Well, a lot of different calls, and I got a lot of calls from Georgia people. And I asked every Georgia fan that called last week, I said, tell me, is it national championship or bust? And I was thinking they would say, well, no. Like you, I've lived through this stuff at Georgia for so long I don't think that's they've now been so close to. I think it's really good in Alabama and winning the SEC championship and then playing and winning to hear this. Everybody matches those two with Clemson and Alabama this year.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that. And on the topic of national championship or bust, I guess my feelings on that are somewhat complicated. On the one hand, I do truly believe that that's the measuring stick for Georgia this year, and the reason why they've done everything else under Kirby Smart. They've won the SEC. They've won a playoff game. They're the only team other than Alabama and Clemson to win a playoff game since this thing began. But that, so I understand that being the measuring stick. However, I am also of the belief that if somehow that comes up short this year, I don't think that changes the one as well, unless something changes that I don't foresee right now. So I think the national championship, and that's the narrative that I don't buy into, and I'm thinking you probably agree with that.
Will have missed their window. No, that's not. Then maybe you can say this is the best collection of players Georgia's had, and the future collections don't look quite as good. Well, that's simply not the case. So I think Georgia will continue to win. There will be talent there, and window's going to close. Don't buy that at all.
Let me talk about Jake Fromm here for a moment, because if you want to make the comparison between Alabama and Clemson, let's face it, we all do, and that happens on shows like this every single day. I think the central focus of that discussion is going to be around Trevor Lawrence, who was spectacular in the national championship game a year ago, Tua Tagovailoa, who was spectacular last year in the first half of the season and obviously made the hero throw at the end of the 2017 national championship game. Do you think right now with Tua and Trevor Lawrence?
Absolutely. I mean, those of us who watch Jake for quarterback, great decision-making, doesn't throw it to the wrong people. He deserves to be on that same level.
Continue to be of the belief that Georgia will play tough games this season. Georgia will happen within the SEC East, Florida included. Do you think that against Florida, it's not going to be that close this season? What do you think with the rest of the SEC?
What is the game, from a Georgia perspective, what is the game that scares you the most? Game for everybody? I just think it falls into a very strange place. I'm looking at Georgia's 5-game closing stretch of Florida, Missouri, Auburn, Texas. That is a concerning part of the SEC championship.
Boy, what a ride that'll like, ruffling with the tradition. But that's not really my beef. More than anything, strategically, I don't think it makes a ton of sense to help out a rival in a series that Georgia has dominated as of late. You've now seen the full 2020 schedule. You know the history of the Deep South's oldest rivalry.
Yep.
What do you think of the change, how it fits with the larger landscape of the SEC, and frankly,
there is no bigger traditionalist than I am, and I'm very traditional when it comes to this game. Auburn, Georgia is, I've said this, conversations with a lot of people. Excuse me. When you go through these schedules, everybody in the conference says, okay, what are your top priorities when it comes to scheduling? What's the most important thing to you? Obviously, the most important thing for Auburn, well, you saw what happened to them. They got what they wanted, but now they play LSU, Alabama back-to-back at the end of the year. So a little bird tipped me onto that one. Says they won't be totally happy. Conversely, Georgia, what is your number one priority scheduling-wise? Week off before Florida. Don't care what you got to do. We want a week off before Florida, and so that's why that is.
Your time and being on the program with us today. We know you've got a lot of written stuff coming up as well, in addition to appearances on the Paul Feinbaum SEC Network. Things like
I'm in business with 3 of my old newspaper buddies and TMGCollegeSports.com. It's part of the Maven group of sports websites, and we've got the country covered, and that's where we are 2 or 3 days a week.
Well, Tony, speaking of our friends, whatever you're having, and of course, we like to also kick off the weekend by thinking about what's coming up for UGA Athletics, and for right now, all systems are pointed towards August 31st in Nashville for Georgia and Vanderbilt. We hope to have a lot of fun that weekend. A lot of folks have been asking us about what we're going to do. We're going to try to get that figured out and tell you here pretty soon. Can't wait for Georgia and Vanderbilt coming up August 31st. It's our Kroger kickoff. They're on sale with the Kroger card if you haven't already. By the way, Gator Hater Updater, how about 1,000? That was a lot to squeeze into one show. I'm sure the folks who were tasked with helping us stay on the air might say it was a little too much, but nonetheless, that was strict. Of course, R.S. Andrews plays all those positions for us. I will tell you, last night, my favorite thing to do, we had a long day in Athens, covering the practice. It's hot when you get home. I love the fact that I can just crank my air conditioning. I know you turn the temperature down, but I think of it as just cranking it up. I love to crank that thing up, let that thing kick in and get really, really cold. Get it under those covers and just rest. And if your house is not quite that cold, well, you need the $99 Smiley tune-up from my friends at R.S. Andrews. You can find them online at rsandrews.com. They will get your system whole gang over there for more book first here today and get a lot of your comments. David Gross says, when are you going to do an event in Savannah? I will be shocked, David, if 365 days from right now we have not done an event in Savannah because of all the things that we get asked to do. Y'all do all those events in Atlanta. You guys are these Atlanta guys. You stay in Atlanta for everything in West Georgia this summer. We were up in the North Georgia mountains last week, so we've gotten out of Atlanta. And the response that's been, hey, thanks for getting out of Atlanta. Now, when are you coming to Savannah? Because with all due respect to some of the places we haven't been, Macon, Albany, wherever, I'm pretty sure 365 days from right now, we will have done something in Savannah. Karen Moses said, yeah, the 912 car salesman today. Hopefully not. That's always on the event of my 1,000 shows. I will say that there's always a lot of things that I'm working on. The one thing about me is that I am my own worst critic, and I think about that kind of stuff all the time. And but you know how sometimes out and about in the environment and the field, as the news guys like to say, I have a tendency to talk a little too like this. I have a tendency to be a very fast talker, and on days when we're trying to do a lot of things, I probably talk even faster. So hopefully not too fast, but that's definitely something that I'm working on. Kathy Aquavia Green says, what are you doing at Vanderbilt? Where can we find you? So I don't really know yet. It's not going to be some really fun things planned, including maybe some big Nashville. It's a great weekend town. Great weekend town. Keith Finney says, BA, does it ask you, hey, what's Georgia's toughest game? You're going to have an answer. No one's over-under is 12. That may have been possible within the last couple of years have been the most likely time for that to happen. So if you were to say, I think that Georgia could lose to Texas A&M, the level of A&M, could be I think that burnout's a real thing, and I think that dissatisfaction with your employment situation is unfortunately also a real thing too. And I think that if you want to judge Jimbo on the end at Florida State, I think it's a hatchet job hit piece that Bleacher Report did the other day on Jimbo that Florida State was obviously a willing accomplice on, to essentially lay all the blame for all the problems that exist in Tallahassee now at Fisher's feet. But y'all, since Florida State and Jimbo Fisher have gotten a divorce, which of those two parties looks to be in the better shape right now? Kathy says that tussling is a Southern word. Yes, Kathy, that is probably true. Let me go over to actually, let me get this one comment here. Matt Rukavina talking about weird stats. I think he's talking about over-unders. There's a funny thing about math for the entire season. Actually, Clemson's a better one to do with this schedule, or as I should say, its schedule. There's not a single game on Clemson's schedule where they are less ability that Clemson has based on, like, say, ESPN, FBI data, things like that. I bet 80% is the least they have. So that you're talking, but the chances of all of those 90-something% probabilities occurring is only about 50-50. You can, go online, learn this formula yourself. You can do the math on this. That while Clemson has a 90-something% chance of winning each of its individual regular season games, to find the probability of them going undefeated, you don't average those probabilities. You look at the chance of all 12 of those occurring, and it's only about 50%. In fact, it's a little bit less than 50%. Clemson's got like a 46% chance of going undefeated based on the FPI data. This is why Vegas builds towers, because the math around some of this kind of stuff is a little fuzzy, and it's not necessarily what you might think it would be. And so that's why you see, teams like Alabama, like all things, take caution when you make bets on these kinds of things. Reginald Johnson saying, BA is celebrating Tank's announcement to Auburn because of the residual effect thereafter. Evans to UGA, so arrival of the Bigsby news. Even for a player like Bigsby, who Jeff Sentell said on our program again today, does not expect to go to Georgia. I don't know that anybody does. When Bigsby makes his announcement, Georgia gets Zachary Evans. And we're all aware that the Bigsby news would seem to point to that being a more likely occurrence. But here's the one thing I'm not going to do, and I hope that you can appreciate this. The one thing I'm not going to do is trample all over a young man's day, even a kid who's not going to end up, air quotes, hating Auburn. Obviously, Eddie and the whole gang here, we love hating Florida. But I don't trash players. I just don't. I'm not going to trash an Auburn player. I'm not going to trash a Florida player. I'm certainly not going to be a strategic component to Big Ball about that and say, well, that's okay. Georgia doesn't want Tank Bigsby anyway. Bigsby deserves to have his day. I'm not going to do that. But yes, it is obvious that most of us take the Bigsby news to be good news when it comes to Zachary Evans. Let me. Okay, so here's Mercury 200 EFI, who says they never even check YouTube till the end. That's not true, Mercury. Now, we have gotten way better about actually. We've essentially started half the time y'all are arguing about something, and it's hard to find the good comments, but nonetheless, embarrassing reason for that. When we're on the road, I can't get YouTube to pull up on my phone because I have the world's oldest cell phone and I can't add any more apps to it, and you can't read the YouTube comments unless you're in the app. So that's what that's about. Now, this is a more serious comment. I didn't realize this. He says that YouTube's been messed up all day. Yeah, I guess mine is like buffering or something. God, I didn't know that, y'all. I'm sorry. Don't know what that's about. I apologize. Now, I don't check. Apologize for all of that. I think, but I do apologize for the mess up on that. I know a lot of you enjoy the YouTube interface better than the Facebook, and since you're not getting the full complement of the show today, we got to figure out what's going on with that. Twitter's been fine. I was commenting on there saying YouTube isn't working. So I guess more of you are commenting on Twitter now. I need to be a little bit more responsive on the Twitter side of this thing. I guess it's just the same way as replying to a tweet. I think they're on here, but it's all in fun except for Dennis and Huck. Yeah, I would probably agree with that, Mercury. I'm in the customer service business, so I want people to be happy, whether it be with the technical interface, which I don't know how to fix, or Dan Riggin says everyone's a critic. Yeah, you listen. That's just part of it.
It's going to be something we're going to fix after the show. I know what it is.
Okay, so says can't wait for Vandy. Got a little teaser from my NFL team last night. That team. Now I'm also not, which will be really fun to see. Somebody said they missed the whole Jeff Sintel segment. Okay, so here's the great news. And this is not an announcement because I'm not ready this fall, which I will tell you about when I can. This may not work, but I think it may be really fun for the podcast. The reason why I bring that up is because somebody mentioned the whole Jeff Sintel segment. Y'all, we do post the podcast every day, and I understand why for some people, YouTube's become a pretty popular podcast platform. Video not even included. We just happen to be on video. So some of you use YouTube as a podcast platform, but the other you'll get a chance to do that there. You'll get a chance there just in case you ever do miss like a Jeff or something like that, because I know a lot of you really want to make sure you have a chance to hear what he says during the week. Best players, either Google for the Androids or Apple for the Apples. Mercury also pointing out maybe this is Dan Mullen trying to sabotage. Anderson says he thinks that Holyfield will make it. He'll take an Artist Payne spot. I'd love to see it. I would. There's a couple things in sports that I'm fascinated by. We're in the PGA Tour playoff season. Y'all saw us at East Lake on Wednesday for the Tour Championship. I'm just as interested in, because I am kind of a big golf fan, or for next week's event. But it's being one of the top 125, and that sort of exempt protected status in the PGA Tour. So the chase to be in the 125, I'm fascinated by. I'm kind of also the same way when it comes to some of the football stuff too. For some reason, if you told me that Holyfield story than I am Baker's story. As I said before, no disrespect to DeAndre. He had a great Georgia career, and he could have a great career with the New York Giants, but he was a first tell. He's just kind of bothered by it. Nobody likes not achieving something you set out to achieve, and he was just kind of, he was that way. So, I feel for him in that regard, but I'm also inspired by the way that he's just not going to give up without a fight. I think that fight's eventually going to pay off. So I love these guys who are trying to make NFL rosters. I think Hard Knocks started this week, And when I've watched Hard Knocks in the past, that's always been the thing I've fixated on the most, those storylines involving the guys who just want their chance and want to make it in this league. And sometimes they do. It's not. You look up and down an NFL roster, they're not all former first-round picks. There are some guys that were undrafted free agents or, kind of every walk of life imaginable. There's at least some representation on NFL rosters from those guys, and so I'm rooting for that. Rooting for that for him. Lavelle Hughes mentioning Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt. So this is not a very astute analysis, but I did notice this yesterday. They're doing some of that sled work and, just different things strike at different times. Boy, Wyatt yesterday and doing some of that kind of stuff was really, really laying a wallop there. Seemed to be, he got a compliment from Trey Scott at one point in time. Seemed to be, really showing pretty good technique in there on that. Wyatt's a guy that we like around here because we did a Marlowe's event with him at one point in time. He's a pretty fun guy and the kind of guy that you do love the idea of. He's one of those that Kirby Smart's kind of referenced in the past. A little more athletic defensive lineman, the kind of guy that you might can do some different things with. So kind of nice to think about him kind of being in the mix there a little bit. I'll get Connor Riley here. Looks like he's ready to chat with us.
And if you're watching on YouTube, I believe the stream issues should be fixed.
Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy, but sometimes my screen's just sort of fizzy anyway.
Give it a second to refresh, and it should be good.
But thanks for getting that done. Certainly appreciate that. Dan Riggin says it is fixed. Chime Dog says as well. G Grace also. So y'all appreciate you showing a little love to Connor for all that kind of stuff. Somebody mentioned wide receivers before too. That was another thing that kind of jumped out at me from being at practice yesterday. My first time to be at practice this year was yesterday. I was really excited about seeing George Pickens in person. He really looks the part, and I'll never pretend to tell you if that means he's going to go on to be as good as I think that he can be or not. It's just too early to tell, right? As I said before, a lot of this stuff is a 50-50 proposition. Pickens is no less a 50-50 proposition than any other prospect is in my mind, even though he looks the part. But believe me when I tell you, that man looks the part. I really enjoyed seeing him, even if it was just for a brief minute. I enjoyed seeing him in person yesterday. What's on your mind today, Connor?
I have a bone to pick with you about your whole calling Kelly Bryant wanting, and I'm not even sure. I haven't seen the comments of him saying he wanted a championship ring. Him getting a championship ring would not be the same thing as those quote unquote participation trophies that you Gen Xers like to chastise us for. It's not like
I think it's less than a. I think it's less than a.
He was the starter for the He was the starter and the finisher for the Texas A&M game, and he played a pretty key role on 4 of those games. And I would say he's probably more deserving for his work in those 4 games. He's more deserving than some of the backups who never had an impact in that game of getting a championship ring. I don't have a problem with Dabo not giving him one, but to say this is part of participation trophy culture, that is, an unfair slight at my generation.
Well, I think that it's a great argument because there's obviously a case to be made for Bryant. He did play in some of the games there last year, but really my dispute on this has more to do with the thing of that somehow coaches are only allowed to do things that everybody's going to like and everybody's going to be happy about. I mean, I think when you choose to transfer in this age, there is a choice that goes along with that. I don't know if Bryant cares about the ring or not. It seems like there are a lot of people that care about it on his behalf. And I just think you're kind of making a choice there at that point in time that, hey, you don't get the spoils that go along with this. And so I wouldn't have been mad at giving him one, but I certainly don't have a problem with Dabo not doing it.
So, so let's say Kelly gets to game 4 and he says, because I believe he would have been a senior last year had he not had the red shirt and transfer ability. Let's say he goes to Dabo and says, hey, I'll be here on the team, but I don't want to play, unless it's a serious injury to Trevor, I don't want to waste my final year of eligibility, just to either fill in for one meaningless game. If I want to play, I want to be the guy. Is that fair to Bryant? Should he be allowed to sort of take that onus onto himself?
I think that's better than completely leaving the team. And there's also a point to be made here that if championship rings were important to Bryant, he wouldn't have transferred to Missouri.
Well, that might not be a fair. Again, he hasn't. None of this has come from Bryant. I will say, so what if Dabo says, well, no, that's not how this works, and then he dismisses him from the team? I think, as much as we talk about coaches and stuff here, players should have some own agency and what they want to do. And, I think more than anything, this is maybe just a power play by Dabo, because he's made some comments saying he's going to leave college football if players start getting paid. Yeah. And, I think this is just another thing of him, maybe trying to flex his muscles and show that, hey, coaches still run this sport.
Yeah, listen, I mean, there are a lot of things about Dabo that the media definitely does not like, and they are looking to take him down a peg on a couple of things. And so, I think that's where some of this kind of stuff comes from as well. What did you think about being at Georgia practice yesterday, Connor?
It was hot once again.
Yeah, it was hot.
There were a few guys, but Eli Wolf was not out there. Rylan Godey was not out there. Nate McBride was not out there. So it sounds like maybe some guy. And it's not to say that those guys have significant injuries or anything like that. It's just they may have been getting treatment because it is the beginning part of the practice before guys really start thumping. It's still sort of hard to really pick anything in particular out in terms of depth chart and whatnot. I don't think we're really going to learn stuff like that until we start getting into the scrimmages and start getting reports back from there. I thought Richard LeCounte had a really interesting comparison from comparing George Pickens to A.J. Green. And I'll be interested to sort of talk to Kirby Smart tomorrow. One of the things I'd like to ask him is, he was on that 08 Alabama team when Julio Jones was a true freshman 5-star, a guy that Alabama program had not had in a while. And I do want to see, what he thought of Julio at that time, and maybe if any of that is applicable to Mr. Pickens.
Well, I'll tell you a quick story about Julio. Our buddy Mike Johnson, who y'all know is a good friend of mine and a guy that played on that Alabama roster when Julio had been there. And Mike was like a lot of players were back in that era, very skeptical of recruiting. And he'd been on the Alabama roster for a couple of years when Alabama was just a team no different than any other. Remember, he played for the end of the Mike Shula era when they were losing games to Auburn and was on the roster for 2 years before Nick Saban got there. Saban gets there, they have that huge 2008 class, and I think a lot of the players in the Alabama roster, as Mike tells the story, were just a little skeptical of some of the hype that exists around some of those guys. But what Mike says is when he saw Julio Jones for the first time as a freshman coming into Alabama, when he saw some of the things that he was capable of doing on the football field, he was blown away immediately. And someone who, after having been through college football, the rigors of that for a couple of years, completely disregarded the average freshman, he said spot on right there, changed his tone right in the moment to say this isn't the typical freshman. So a comparison between Jones and Pickens would be a pretty significant one given what I've been told about the reaction to Julio right there at the beginning of his Alabama career, that he was noticeably different than everybody else. So if you were to put Pickens in the same category of Julio Jones, you're putting him in the category of a guy who was an instantaneous difference maker and someone who gained the respect of his teammates right away. So if that comparison eventually gets made, you got to keep that in mind. What else is going on? Let me go back over to YouTube now that they're all they're running and getting things good. Then we're going to get off the air here in just a little bit. Jalen Jackson says Julio Jones is different from any other player. Pickens does physically remind me of him, though. The key word there for me is physical, though, because Julio was the classic, what we think of as Saban-style, Kirby-style wide receiver, and that he was willing to block and be physical from the beginning of his Alabama career, and he still continues that working with the Atlanta Falcons right now. So I'm guessing that in Hoover High School, I'm not quite sure how much of that Pickens had to do, but that's going to be one of the things to also see about him. I think that Pickens does have a pretty big body, and is he willing to use that? I don't mean like the cliche thing of, Georgia asks his wide receivers to block, but you are going to have to block some. And being a good blocker enables you to be on the field a lot more. We talked yesterday about the 2017 deal when you had the blocking receivers in the game and you had the catching receivers in the game. If you're only a catching receiver, if you're only a pass catching target, then you're not going to be on the field nearly as much. And so I do hope that Pickens is able to show off that physicality.
Yeah, and one thing with Julio, it might, and we don't know enough about Pickens to really know this, but over the years we've seen Julio's. He's a quiet guy. He is not a guy that's really going to talk or demand a whole lot of attention in terms of when he's speaking with the media and whatnot. The really only thing, and this is certainly understandable, he's ever really made a big guffaw or a point over is wanting to get that next contract,
sure,
which is certainly understandable. I watched. I finally got to watch the episode of Hard Knocks yesterday, and to contrast, Julio with who he is to Antonio Brown and even guys like Odell Beckham, Jarvis Landry, it's really sort of a stark comparison between how they go about their business. And Antonio Brown is every bit as good as Julio, but it is very stark to see the mentality between those two guys. And I'm not sure that if a guy who had like Odell's mentality does now, or if Antonio Brown's mentality does now, would fit as well in Georgia's system as, say, Julio Jones.
Well, the other thing I want to think about Julio Jones is that I think of him as being a very precise route runner. The honest truth is I don't even really know what I say when I mean that, but that's just kind of the thing that comes up as a part of his profile. I remember being back at Georgia's Pro Day this year and watching some of those receivers being coached up to go through routes so that the scouts that were there could evaluate them. I remember that being a big part of what went on. And I remember how interesting I thought that was about what the scouts themselves were looking for. That's another thing for a guy like Pickens in terms of just how big of a major impact that he makes because, I was not a great high school athlete, but I played with some good high school athletes. And the one thing about being a good athlete in high school, and I'm sure this is extra true for a great athlete, you sometimes can just sort of get by with that. Pickens is just bigger than everybody else, and compared to the average high school athlete, he's also a lot faster. And sometimes that's just enough. And when you get to the college level, that's obviously not just enough. You've also got to add some precision to your overall talent level. So when you start looking for, will it happen for him as quickly as it has for some freshmen? Will it not? I think his willingness to be physical is going to be a big part of that because you can just leave him on the field more. And I think that his ability to understand the precision that's required to kind of go out there and do battle with these defensive backs who are just as athletic as he is. Those are the aspects of this that remain to be seen. It's that extra 5% or extra 10% that it's the difference between someone who eventually will be good and someone who could potentially be great right away.
Green Soldier asked a good question on YouTube. This is BA. What game do you see players who we've been waiting on to begin to show up in the starting rotation, guys like Pickens, White? And you might be tempted to say, Notre Dame. I think that's when you start to see these guys get on the field at first and start making plays. But in terms of actually starting and being sort of those every down guys, I think you're going to see that in the Kentucky game. It's the week before a bye week. It's the week before the Florida game, so you can sort of throw them out there. That's a game Georgia should win by 40 points this year. It's at home. This Kentucky team doesn't figure to be as good last year. It's a game they should have beaten Kentucky by 40 points last year anyway, in my opinion. And I think, that's a game where you're going to be able to put them in a control. Did you just throw your pen or lose your pen?
I didn't mean to.
You're going to be able to see guys like Pickens, White. I'm going to mention Dominic Blaylock because I have so much stock in him. Maybe a guy like Tyreek Stevenson. Certainly a guy like Nakobe Dean. I think Dean and maybe Nolan Smith as well might be the outliers in this group in terms of, if they play well the rest of this camp, they might be starting week one. But, some of those other guys and certainly the guys who work more in rotations, I think that Kentucky game is the game to circle for.
I understand what you're saying. That my answer to this is a little bit different. I think Georgia's going to have a pretty good idea of what it has a chance to be from a wide receiver core at Tennessee. I think, barring injury, the Tennessee secondary is pretty good. And I think being on the road in a hostile environment, which with all due respect, Vanderbilt won't be a hostile environment. It's going to be an interesting road game, big-time TV audience, but not a hostile road environment because at least half the crowd's going to be Georgia fans. But at Tennessee to start the month of October against a secondary that played pretty well a year ago, and they bring back some talent there in that group, that's a day where if a guy really plays well, then you've probably really got something. Or it's the kind of day where if a guy can be on the field, a Blaylock or a Pickens or a Robertson, somewhere along those lines, and it works as the growing pains to maybe show up against a Kentucky. Certainly you've got to have that by the time you play Florida because Florida is an experienced secondary. That's the one area in which they are very competent. You need to be able to match that up with some receivers by then. But the cram session, the cram course to get ready for the games that matter most for Georgia is at Tennessee. And that's a game where I hope that Georgia throws the ball some because I want to see those guys, the phrase that got used this week, was it Coley who said that the receiver's being thrown into the fire? With all due respect, there's only so much throwing into the fire you can do during practice. On the road against an SEC rival that would love nothing more than to take you down a peg, that is what being thrown in the fire is all about. And that's the kind of chance I think that Georgia has a real opportunity to sharpen its teeth just a bit and find out a little bit more about what it has in its wide receiver core. Good secondary for the Vols on the road. Georgia hopefully experimenting with the passing game just a little bit. Doesn't need to do that to beat Tennessee, but does need to do that to beat some other teams later on in the year. That's a spot where I'd love to see the receivers put on display.
Are we sure it's a good Tennessee secondary, or is Jeremy Pruitt doing that thing he did at Georgia, which, to his credit, I believe that 2015 Georgia team was I was definitely top 10. It may have been number 1 in pass defense that year, but, if you had the right athletes, you could really take advantage of them. I do wonder if Pruitt is able to sort of, smoke and mirrors his way to a top 10 defense, but I still might have some questions about how ultimately talented that entire secondary is.
I mean,
go ahead.
I won't pretend to have watched every snap they've taken, but I do know based on recruiting stuff, everybody wanted Nigel Warrior. They've got him. Alontae Taylor was a player that everybody wanted. Tennessee told him he could be a wide receiver. Now they've got him playing in the secondary. Bryce Thompson was a guy that everybody wanted. Tennessee told him he could play quarterback, and now he's playing secondary.
I'm not sure everybody wanted Bryce Thompson.
But I mean, that's a guy that certainly had a nice profile coming out of coming out of high school. So there's some pretty good athletes back there, and numerically, they did not perform badly a year ago.
We'll see.
So Wayne Kirkland says Pickens may be the guy where Fromm can sling it and have his wide receiver go get the ball. I mean, that's the thing to me. The Georgia offense is just missing, has been missing. I know that Pickens is not a burner, but what you hope is, just because of the respect that you have to pay him near the line of scrimmage, I'm hoping that he can create some separation. Georgia's had some really fast receivers. McColl's as fast as anybody. But there aren't that many moments where you see a Georgia receiver in the Kirby Smart era just run away from somebody, just create wide separation. And it ought to be easier for Georgia because of the fact that there's at least one safety usually that's having to figure out what the running game is going to do or figure out what Fromm may do in terms of a short passing situation. He's obviously pretty aggressive with that kind of stuff. The opportunity for Georgia just to swing for the fences ought to be there. And yes, I do think of Pickens as being the most likely guy to haul in those balls. I think that's the national championship difference for Georgia. When all of a sudden now you have to be constantly aware of him mossing somebody. I just think that's the I think that's the thing that could change the Georgia offense in a major way. I told y'all this before. I only need 4 more pass attempts per game from Georgia to be a completely different offense. But of those 4, I need 2 of them to be really big completions. If you can give Georgia 2 more, 35, 40-yard completions per game, if you could do something like that, then you've changed the entire dynamic of the offense. Because that was essentially last year the difference between Alabama and Georgia. And for most of the season, the Alabama offense was just more electric than Georgia's was. But based on numbers, the two teams ran the ball essentially about the same amount for the same level of success. But Alabama found a couple of more deep connections in the passing game per game, and that made all the difference in the world.
One interesting thing I will say about separation, I mentioned watching Hard Knocks earlier, and they had footage of Antonio Brown working out there. He was not, the fastest guy in terms of 40, in terms of maybe straight line speed. But in terms of getting just separation, he is so quick off both the line of scrimmage and just in those little nuanced areas of just creating, a ton of separation. And I'll be interested to see if maybe, Pickens is able to do that. Certainly, I think maybe a guy like Dominic Blaylock as well. Demetrius Robertson is worth mentioning there in addition to all of them. Just in terms of maybe not even necessarily, we talk a lot about 40 times speed. That short shuttle speed, especially in terms of getting open in the middle of the field, might be just as important and important a number to look at for Georgia fans in terms of, what you're really looking for in a wide receiver.
Our buddies over at Breda Pest Management checking in on the YouTube comment section. We're talking about Pickens wearing the 83, I guess, now. I'm assuming, and Brady was mentioning this as well, that probably transitions back to 1 probably by the time the season starts, the kind of thing that...
Maybe.
And I
maybe he keeps it at 83.
I know you've written about the curse of the number 1 jersey, which I think is kind of a funny thing to think about. But as of now, Pickens is wearing the 83 there, so kind of a cool dynamic going on with that. One of the drills that Georgia was doing yesterday, just for a brief minute, I got a chance to see this, where they were putting the kind of like tackling dummy up, and it became almost like a defensive back that you leapt over in a short situation. It was basically practicing, kind of going up and high pointing the ball or something like that. It's fun to watch those guys do that. It's fun to watch them do that. Devin Glenn pointing out that he is still listed as number 1 on the official roster. I think the problem with that is official is a very loose definition. Very loose definition when it comes to stuff like that. Very loose. All right, any final thoughts from anybody before we go here today on Facebook, YouTube, or anything else? Brent Chapman making his case for Demetrius Robertson. I think there's a strong case to be made for Robertson. I do believe he's probably number 1 in that slot position right now. But if you make a really strong case for D-Rob, you are taking some expectations off of Dominic Blaylock's plate. I don't know if there's room for both those guys to have a great year, just given the fact they're both going to be in a similar position. Georgia's 4th pass catching option is almost always going to be a tight end. So I don't know. I don't know about that.
I'm not sure about that. I certainly. I mean, Kirby has said, they're not going to pigeonhole Blaylock just to the slot, and it wouldn't surprise me if over the course of the season, if either Blaylock or Robertson sort of show that they're capable blockers, they might sort of move into that outside wide receiver role.
Well, the guy I want there is Robertson. If Robertson,
right.
I mean, Robertson's highest and best use is outside receiver because he's so fast. You can't. I mean, you're not going to take advantage of that as much on the inside. Now, yes, Georgia did throw deep to McCole a few times out of the slot, so that's a play they have in their playbook. But for the most part, this is not Baylor. You're not going to have deep routes being run by slot receivers all that much. So if you could tell me that Robertson can move outside, I think that's just really exciting. If you told me that Georgia's 3 receivers on the field were the size of Pickens, another outside receiver, the speed of Robertson, with Blaylock working on the inside, with all due respect to guys like Tyler Simmons and Lawrence Cager, some of the other names that could be in that discussion, that's a really fun trio to think about. Just the ways in which that they could play off of each other, little pick plays and things like that, or rub plays, I guess the offense prefers to call them. Boy, there's a lot you could do right there. There's a lot you could do right there.
Blind Squirrel Sports SBA, which upperclassmen will step up in regards to leadership and ensure that this team takes no one for granted? From Jerry Reed, Monty Rice, Andrew Thomas. I think those are the 4 names to really look for in terms of upperclassmen leadership.
The one name that you did not give me there, though, and I think you're correct in all those, I think that J.R. Reed.
I did say Reed.
Well, no, I'm sorry.
Wow.
I'm going to get to that. I think that J.R. Reed thrives on being a leader. It's very easy to fool the media when you only speak to them for a few minutes at a time. Reed may just have me completely snowed because I think that he loves being a leader. I think he's very comfortable and natural in that spot. So he's definitely one. All the names that Connor mentioned, I think, belong in that discussion. What I would add to that is, I don't know what kind of productivity they're going to have. There are some very interesting upperclassmen names involved with that defensive line rotation right now. That's a competition where it's tough to know who's going to be on the field the most. But, Marshall he's a man. This is not a kid, fresh out of high school anymore. He's a man. Justin Young, some experience. I think Barnett's got a little bass in his voice. So there is that group who, from all those guys, Marshall will be the safer bet of the bunch. And maybe you add Julian Rochester in this too, I guess. He's been around for a while. Some of the older guys in that defensive line situation, in terms of having a voice for this team, you may get something out of that group as well because, sometimes who Georgia sends out to speak to the media kind of matters here. And back during the spring, you were hearing from some of those guys a lot. So I don't know if they're among your best players. Georgia's got some young players who are really pushing them for playing time. But they are certainly among, the guys that I think have influence on the other players, leadership council, things like that in all likelihood. So if you want to add some leadership stuff to, hey, no one's going to let anybody, goof off and, act a fool, some of those defensive linemen can jerk you back in line, I believe, if they need to. I believe they can definitely.
It's just going to be and I wrote about this morning, sort of a week-long practice observations thing. There have been a lot of guys on the defensive line who have already played a lot, and to get an idea of, who's going to be the trusted guy there, I think we're not going to find that out until we start getting into the season.
All right, we're going to get ready to go here. B. Ransom says, what about quarterback depth? Is there anything new on Mathis? So Mathis is out there going through practice. What a little bit of it I got to see of him yesterday. He looked pretty good. He looks really cool in his uniform. I mean, he looks like a football player. I think he's probably throwing the ball a little bit more accurately than it seemed like he was back during the spring, but he's also probably a little ways away from being fully healthy here. I have heard some exciting things about Stetson Bennett. Not to say that Stetson Bennett's going to be the next Baker Mayfield or anything like that, but I've heard his accuracy praised. I've heard his arm strength praised. He may even have a stronger arm than many people might think. So there's still continuing to be some good things said about Stetson Bennett. This is not the same as it was the last couple of years when Georgia's number 2 quarterback was a former 5-star or a very highly rated 4-star. But there is not a lack of confidence about the guys that Georgia does have. I start to believe that the more I hear from people who have a chance to see more of practice than I do. All right, we're going to get ready to go here. Good stuff. Thank you all for being with us. Huge thanks to R.S. Andrews. As we get ready to get out of here, let me also mention something about my friends at the AJC as well. You know, you can get your Atlanta news now at ajc.com throughout the day. I want to invite you to check in throughout the day because there's always a lot of stuff going on. So please make sure that you find time to go take a look at that kind of stuff and see what is happening around the AJC with there's a great weekend preview at the AJC each and every day, or I should say each and every week as you head towards the weekend, new movies coming out, concerts, things like that. We're getting close to festival season around the city of Atlanta with a lot of that kind of stuff going on as we head towards the fall. You can keep up with all of that when it comes to your Atlanta news now at ajc.com, so please make sure you check that out. Also to Dari and the gang at R.S. Andrews, thanks for making this a possibility. Y'all check them out for your air, heating, plumbing, electric needs online at rsandrews.com. Have a great weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday, 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then.